angels, it's Hailey Reese, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am so grateful that you are here, and I hope that you are having an absolutely beautiful, wonderful, magical, all the good things, morning, afternoon, or night, whatever it is for you when this video finally reaches you. Today's video is one that I couldn't be more excited to share with you if I tried. Today we're diving into an absolutely bone-chilling, life-changing, terrifying, and yet simultaneously somehow also hauntingly beautiful. It's basically everything that a terrifying experience has, except this one, despite having all of the formula for it, isn't some Hollywood made-up tale. This is a very real experience, and when I tell you, you are going to have chills all over your body by the end of it, I am not exaggerating. Today we're diving into a real-life paranormal experience that occurred on Halloween night. This is unlike anything that I've covered in a very long time here on my channel. So with all of that out of the way and all of that said, sit back, relax, maybe turn a light on, because this experience is about to get dark. So this experience begins with a guy named Jacob. Now, this entire experience has been shared from Jacob himself, and Jacob basically begins every single time of sharing this story with a massive disclaimer about the fact that this has haunted him for the past couple of years. He's been unable to shake it, and it has absolutely transformed the way that he views the world and the way that he views what most deem as unbelievable. Now, at the time of this experience, Jacob and his brother were not in the best of places, and this was primarily because of Jacob. In order to really understand this experience, you firstly have to really understand Jacob and where he was at this point in his life. I mean, these spirits chose Jacob for a reason. And that's because at this point in Jacob's life, he was at a real crossroads, but not just any average crossroads, a crossroads of whether or not he was heading down the path of destruction and ultimately death, or if he was going to face the music and completely do a 360 and change his life around. Now, if you'd asked Jacob that Halloween morning where he was heading in life, he'd have told you pretty soon he'd be just about 6 feet under. Jacob had lost pretty much everything in his life that he put value on besides those that he cared about. He'd lost his job. He'd lost one of his best friends. He'd lost his sense of direction. And ultimately, he was faced with the deepest depression he'd ever been through in his entire life. Everything in Jacob's life was completely upside down, including his relationships with his family. Now, this wasn't because his family didn't love him. It was, in fact, the exact opposite. Jacob's brother specifically saw all of the red flags where his brother was concerned, and he felt like if he didn't intervene and show some tough love, well, things weren't going to end well for Jacob. You see, Jacob's brother had had a dark past of his own. They didn't really go too much into it, but it seems as though this family had faced a lot of death, destruction, and disappointment. And Jacob's brother had found himself at one point heading down a bad path too. But he'd made the decision to break the generational curse and to go on and be something that he'd hoped his parents could be. Jacob's brother had gotten married and had just had a little girl a couple of years before this. And this almost made Jacob even angrier. He can admit it now, and back then he really couldn't. But he felt like looking at his brother was looking at everything that he would never have. And unless you've been in that type of a depression, it's unfathomable. But that's basically where Jacob was, heading down this destructive path, this careless path, and this F the world attitude consumed him. But his brother had asked him if he'd fly down and visit him and his wife and daughter, because they'd only moved that year to a completely different state, completely different city, and they'd started totally fresh. So his brother felt like if he could get Jacob out there to see that there's life outside of that troubled town they were growing up in, and that he could get out there and just find himself. Now, to this day, Jacob doesn't understand why it is he felt so pulled to take his brother up on this offer. Perhaps, hindsight, now he can have a better idea. But something in him changed the moment his brother asked him to come out there. And so he found himself at the store, finding some cheap little Dracula costume, packing it up, and heading to a totally different state to see his brother, his sister-in-law, and his niece. Now, it's said that at first, Jacob and his brother seemed to be okay. Jacob was kind of like a sleeping bear that you don't want to poke or wake up. And so as long as his brother tiptoed around the sensitive subject matters, it seemed as though things were going perfectly fine. Now, Jacob was set to be there for the week leading up to Halloween and then 2 days after Halloween. And so for the week leading up to Halloween, everything was relatively normal. His brother kind of tiptoed around Jacob's trigger points, and it was really nice for Jacob to spend this time with his family. As Halloween rolls around, Jacob claims that he just remembers waking up that morning and just feeling like everything was different. So much so that even though for the week leading up to Halloween, he dreaded going out and going trick-or-treating, something in him felt like he had to. And the whole day there was just something off energetically, is the only way that Jacob could describe it. Now, Jacob was set to take his niece out with his brother, and his sister-in-law was going to stay home and finish making dinner. So that was the plan. The three of them were going to go out. They were going to take the little one trick-or-treating, and it was going to be this wholesome Halloween night. But halfway through, things would take a really quick turn. For whatever reason, it seemed as though something changed with Jacob's brother, and Jacob could sense that the dreaded conversation was coming. Every time that his niece would go up to trick or treat and the two of them would stay at the sidewalk, all he could do was sense the energy and anticipate when his brother was going to break the silence with basically talking to him about everything going on and trying to knock some sense in him and set Jacob straight. This was basically inevitable, and after a couple of houses, the conversation came, and it was time for Jacob to face the music. And as his brother's talking, this just steams into an argument, as Jacob feared it would. And as his little niece comes prancing back from the door she just trick-or-treated at, Jacob could see in her innocent expression that she was picking up on this. And the last thing he wanted was to ruin her Halloween. So, in a quick split-second decision, Jacob shakes his brother's hand and tells him, "I'll meet you at the house, bro. I gotta go. I'm gonna meet you at the house." Now his brother is yelling out after him because Jacob's never been here. Not only has he not been to this new city and this new neighborhood, but he's never been to this state. But Jacob was convinced and certain that he could find his own way home. And that's what he did. He sat walking, trying to recall the way home. And all he could think was, we've only been out here about an hour. We could only get so far. And so he headed back. But this is where things would take an absolutely unexplainable, unimaginable turn. Jacob said that he began walking and walking, and for a while, he was seeing these houses that he recognized. So he knew he was on the right path backwards. See, something about Jacob is that he may not be the most responsible individual, or wasn't at the time, but he was very directionally gifted. He was somebody that could go somewhere once and know by memory how to get back. So he was pretty convinced that he knew where he was going and he was on his way. And that was when Jacob realized that he only had to turn down one more street, and at the end of the street, it should be his brother's house. But as Jacob turns down this street, everything feels different. You see, Jacob is seeing these people in costumes, but they're looking at him in a way as if he's the monster. Now, granted, he is dressed up as a vampire, but so are a lot of people. And all these people that are dressed up as these creatures too are looking at him weird, noticing him weird. And Jacob's taking note of this too. So he picks up his pace a little bit. Jacob described feeling like he was a piece of meat in a dinosaur exhibit. Specifically, a dinosaur exhibit where the dinosaurs are not fossilized. His terms, not mine. But basically, he felt like he was this prize, this snack, this something that everyone on this street is drawn to. And as he's passing by them, he's noticing something in their eyes, a level of desperation, of lost. All he can sense is that these people are looking to him for something, but it didn't feel good. And so he begins picking up his pace and walking faster and faster. But he realizes he's almost looping the same street. He notices he keeps passing by and seeing the same people. He said he keeps walking when all of a sudden he feels like someone's walking directly behind him, this feeling like they're going to step on his shoes. And as he looks down, he sees a little girl. She seems to be dressed as some sort of a dead little girl. She's got red spatter all over her outfit. Her skin is super, super pale, and her eyes are super black around them. Jacob remembers thinking that whoever had done her makeup and outfit did an exceptional job because she truly looked like a dead little girl. There was no mistaking what she was meant to be. He said the little girl looked at him as if she could see right through him. Jacob remembers smiling at the little girl and then deciding that he's going to continue walking because, again, everything feels weird and he's not sure where he is at this point now. The little girl looks at him and makes a sad face as she notices he's going to keep walking away. Jacob turns back and looks at the little girl, and she asks him, "Do you want to see our haunted house?" Jacob says for whatever reason, he felt like he had to stop. And as he stops and looks at the little girl, he looks behind her and sees this house with one light on upstairs. He said the little girl looks at him and points to the house and says, "It's haunted." And when he asks where everyone is, she says, "Well, you'll have to see." The little girl just starts walking towards the house. Now, all Jacob can think is that they've done some sort of setup for a haunted house, like even I had neighbors who used to set up their garages or their basements, which kind of creepy now looking back, as haunted houses that you could enter and get your candy in and whatnot. So I'm assuming that's kind of what he's thinking, and he begins walking into the house. He said when he went inside, it was as if the house was a time capsule. All the furniture was dated. It was very clean, very organized, but somehow it was very, very dated. It was like stepping into this time capsule. And as he goes inside, he follows the little girl and he notices that there's a little scene set here. There's spatter all throughout various spots throughout the house. The little girl starts going slowly up the stairs and Jacob follows her. She leads him to the main room and looks at him. And that's when she says, and Jacob will never forget, "Mommy was killed here." The little girl points over to the wall where he can see kind of an idea of the scene that had been played out or that they were trying to depict. But he remembers thinking it was strange because it was very specific in each room. This little girl walks him through each themed room, telling him, and then the monster came here. She walks him to the next room, which seems to be a little boy's room, and she explains the monster came here next and opens up the closet. And there it was clear that was a whole nother section of the place that was meant to be really creepy. Now, as Jacob's walking, he begins to notice that he's the only adult in this house with this little girl. And I mean, that's not the most fantastic look, but again, it's this super haunted house. And so he turns to the little girl and he says, "Where are your parents?" And she just gets a sad look on her face and continues on this haunted house tour. The little girl then leads him down the stairs and into the kitchen, telling him this really creepy story of this murder that had taken place here and this monster who had came in and killed the mommy and the daddy and the boy. And as she walks into the living room, she looks at Jacob and she says, "And then me, right here." He looks at the little girl and he starts to get a little bit frightened because none of this is making any sort of sense. And she looks at him as he's backing up and she says, "Please don't go. Nobody stays." And as he goes out the door and looks back to the house, he just sees that one light that was on flick off. And he starts panicking and going on his quest once again to find his way home. Now, as he reaches the end of this street and loops back up again, well, suddenly he's right on the right path. And at the end of that street, well, there's his brother's house. He gets inside and there's his brother, sister-in-law, and niece all worried because Jacob's been gone for hours. Even though it felt like maximum an hour to Jacob, there's hours of time missing. Jacob starts telling his brother where he'd been and what had happened, and his brother's looking at him perplexed, saying, "Which way did you come from?" And he explains that he just came from a house that had a whole haunted house set up on the street over. And as he's telling his brother this, his brother's looking at him like he's crazy. His brother walks over and sniffs his breath to see if he's been out drinking, checks his pupils to see if he's on something. You see, the following day, Jacob would go with his brother on a walk to show him this house that had the haunted house theme inside of it. But as they walked to the street that Jacob was certain he'd been on, he realized it was a street with only a couple of abandoned houses. The house that he'd seen was right there, abandoned, run down, as if it was just the bones of the house. Nobody had lived in this house for decades. And yet Jacob was convinced that he'd been inside it. He told his brother everything about it. And that was when his brother walked him home, opened up his laptop, and sat him down. You see, this little small town had an urban legend of the houses that had happened there. That family had supposedly had some sort of secrets. It's from so long ago now that nobody knows exactly what happened. All they know is that the family disappeared, that the house was found in immaculate condition back then, and that nobody was able to inhabit it afterwards because they all felt like it was haunted. Remember, the little girl said, "Do you want to come inside my haunted house?" As he went to the local library and dug down the rabbit hole of asking the locals the legend, well, it seems as though the legend went that somebody had done something to that family and nobody knew quite what, but that they'd gotten away with it. No justice had been served. And nobody knew what really happened there. Anybody who had tried to live in the house had experiences that led them to believe it was haunted until eventually the house would sit abandoned. But why is it that Halloween was that street lively? I mean, when Jacob describes it even now, he says that he saw a bunch of strange creatures and people. But he saw a couple of houses and they were preserved in their time. Jacob peeked in the windows and the bone structure of the home was exactly the home he'd been in the night before. Except it was dusty, dirty, and empty. No furniture at all. Jacob explained to his brother what had happened, and nobody had any idea how Jacob could have known that. This was something only the locals talked about. This wasn't a wide known legend. Jacob said he could hardly search it until he knew what to search for. And yet he'd met that little girl, covered in blood, pale-skinned, and she'd basically walked him through her version of events. As Jacob recalls, she walked him room to room, to each room that the monster would slowly claim her family in, until eventually it was her. Jacob remembers seeing her sad little eyes as he left, and to this day he wonders if the reason she said the haunted house is because that's all people have ever called it. But he knows he met that little girl. The saddest part is in the home, he'd only seen her. He didn't see anybody else, leading him to believe that her spirit is there alone, seemingly until somebody helps her cross over. Jacob doesn't know if it was the Halloween energy or simply that he was so lost and on the brink of death himself that he was able to find something deeper. After he left there, he began taking his life a lot more serious, fostering, harboring, and nurturing his relationships. And now Jacob has went on to have a wife and kids of his own. But that Halloween still haunts him. He basically walked through a spiritual reenactment of a murder. And yet, even when he tried to go to the police station and claim that he knew what had happened, nobody cared. It was so long ago now, and the house sat abandoned. They looked at him like he was crazy, perhaps a drunk on Halloween night. But Jacob knows what he saw, and in some weird way that experience saved his life. But who were the others on the street? And what street was he wandering down? What do you guys think of Jacob's encounter? Do you think that it's made up, or do you think that he really did meet the spirit of a little girl whom the unimaginable had happened to, and she just happened to walk him through the scene? What do you think? Let me know down below. And that's it for today's video. If you guys are new to my channel or you are just not yet subscribed but you enjoy my content, I would super appreciate it if you would go ahead and click that subscribe button. And please give this video a big thumbs up if you did enjoy it. Remember, my loves, do all things with kindness. And until tomorrow, I love you. Bye, guys.